With regard to Eusthathius, it would be sacrilegious to leave out what would convey the truth. All men were agreed that he was not only observed to be a most noble character, but also most gifted with eloquence when put to the test, while the charm that sat on his tongue and lips seemed to be nothing less than witchcraft. His mildness and amiability so blossomed out in what he said and gushed forth with his words, that those who heard his voice and speeches surrendered themselves like men who had tasted the lotus, and they hung on that voice and those speeches. So closely did he resemble the musical sirens that the emperor, for all that he was wrapped up in the books of the Christians, sent for him at the time when he was alarmed by the state of affairs, and was hard-pressed by impending danger from the king of the Persians, who had once already laid siege to Antioch and raided it with his bowmen. For unexpectedly, on a sudden, he seized a height that commanded the theatre, and with his arrows shot and massacred a great crowd of spectators. In this similar crisis, all men were so held captive and enchanted by Eustathius that they did not hesitate to command a man of the Hellenic faith to the ears of the emperor, though the earlier emperors had been accustomed to elect for embassies men who had won distinction in the army, or military prefects, or men who were next in rank to these and had been selected for office. But at that time, at the imperious call of necessity, Eustathius was sought out and admitted by general consent to the most prudent of all men. Accordingly, he was summoned by the emperor and came forthwith, and so potent was the charm on his lips that those who had advised that the embassy should be dispatched in the charge of Eustathius won greater consideration than before from the emperor, and he inclined more favorably towards him. Moreover, some of these men set out of their own accord to accompany the embassy, because they wished to employ a still greater test, whether in his encounter with the barbarians Eustathius should prove to possess the same power to enchant and persuade. When they arrived in Persia, Shapur was reported to be, and actually was, tyrannical and savage towards those who approached him. Nevertheless, when Eustathius, for the embassy in general, was allowed to access the king, the latter could not but admire the expression of his eyes, which was at once amiable and proudly indifferent, in spite of the many preparations that the king had devised in order to dazzle and overawe the man. And when he heard his voice conversing so equably, and with no effort, when he heard him run over his arguments so modestly and good-naturedly, he bade him withdraw. And Eustathius went out, leaving the tyrant a captive to his eloquence. Presently he sent a message by his household officials to invite him to the table, and when he obeyed the summons, since the king seemed to have a natural bent for virtue, Shapur joined him at the banquet. Thus Eustathius became his companion at table, and by his eloquence won such influence over him that the king of Persia came with an ace of renouncing his upright tiara, laying aside his purple and bejeweled attire, and putting on instead the philosopher's cloak of Eustathius. So successfully did the latter run down the life of luxury and the pomps and vanities of the flesh, to such depths of misery did he seem to bring down those who loved their bodies. But this was prevented by certain magi, who happened to be at the court, and kept asserting that the man was nothing but a mere conjurer, and they persuaded the king to reply that the Roman emperor, by asking him why, when fortune had bestowed on them so many distinguished men, they sent persons no better than slaves who had enriched themselves, and the whole result of the embassy was contrary to men's expectations. In my researches of this man, I have come upon evidence of the following, namely, that the whole of Greece prayed to see him and implored the gods that he might visit them. Moreover, the omens and those who were skilled to interpret them agreed that this would come to pass. But when they proved to be mistaken, for he did not visit Greece, the Greeks sent an embassy to him, and chose for this embassy their most famous wise men. The purpose of their mission was to discuss with the renowned Eustathius this question: why did not the facts accord with these omens? He listened to them, and then investigated and sifted the evidence of men who were famed in this science, and had a wide renown, and cross-examined them, asking what was the size, color, and shape of the omens. Then, as his manners was, he smiled at them, on hearing the true facts. For a falsehood has no place in the choir of the gods, so too it has none in their utterance. And he said, Nay, these omens did not foretell this visit from me. Then he said something that in my judgment was too high for a mere mortal, for this was his reply: The omens revealed were too trivial and too tardy for such dignity as mine. After this, the renowned Eustathius married Sosipatra, who, by her surpassing wisdom, made her own husband seem inferior and insignificant. So far did the fame of this woman travel that it is fitting for me to speak of her at greater length, even in this catalogue of wise men. She was born in Asia, near Ephesus, in that district which the river Cayster traverses and flows through, and hence gives it the name of the plain. She came from a prosperous family, blessed with wealth, and while she was still a small child, she seemed to bring a blessing on everything. Such beauty and decorum illuminated her infant years. Now she had reached the age of 5 when she had just reached the age of 5 when two old men, both were past their prime, but one was rather older than the other, carrying ample wallets and dressed in garments of skins, made their way to a country estate belonging to Sosipatra's parents, and persuaded the steward, as they were easily able to do, to entrust to them the care of the vines. When a harvest beyond all expectation was the result, the owner himself was there, and with him was the little girl Sosipatra. Men's amazement were boundless, and they went so far as to suspect the intervention of the gods. The owner of the estate invited them to this table, and treated them with the highest consideration, and he reproached the other laborers on the estate with not obtaining the same results. The old men, on receiving Greek hospitality and a place at a Greek table, were smitten and captivated by the exceeding beauty and charm of the little girl Sosipatra, and they said, "Our other powers we keep to ourselves hidden and unrevealed, and this abundant vintage that you so highly approve is laughable and mere child's play, which takes no account of our superhuman abilities. But if you desire from us a fitting return for this maintenance and hospitality, not in money or perishable and corruptible benefits, but one far above you and your way of life, a gift whereof the fame shall reach the skies and touch the stars, hand over this child Sosipatra to us, who are more truly her parents and guardians, and until the 5th year from now fear no disease for the little girl, nor death, but remain calm and steadfast. But take care not to set your feet on this soil till the 5th year come with the annual revolutions of the sun. And of its own accord wealth shall spring up for you and shall blossom forth from the soil. Moreover, your daughter shall have a mind not like a woman's or a mere human being. Nay, you yourself also shall have higher than mortal thoughts concerning the child. Now if you have good courage, accept our words with outspread hands. But if any suspicions awake in your mind, consider that we have said nothing." Hearing this, the father bit his tongue, and humble and awestruck put the child into their hands and gave her over to them. Then he summoned his steward and said to him, "Supply the old men with all that they need, and ask no questions." Thus he spoke, and before the light of dawn began to appear, he departed, as though fleeing from his daughter and his estate. Then those others, whether they were heroes or demons or of some race still more divine, took charge of the child, and into what mysteries they initiated her no one knew, and with what religious rite they consecrated the girl was not revealed even to those who were most eager to learn. And now approached the appointed time when all the accounts of the revenue of the state were due. The girl's father came to the farm and hardly recognized his daughter. So tall was she, and her beauty seemed to him to have changed his character. And she too hardly knew her father. He even saluted her reverently, so different did she appear to him in his eyes. When her teachers were there, and the table was spread, they said, "Ask the maiden whatever you please." But she interposed, "Nay, father, ask me what happened to you on your journey." He agreed that she should tell him. Now, since he was so wealthy, he traveled in a 4-wheeled carriage, and with this sort of carriage many accidents are liable to happen. But she related every event, not only what had been said, but his very threats and fears, as though she had been driving with him. Her father was roused to such a pitch of admiration that he did not merely admire her, but was dumb with amazement, and was convinced that his daughter was a goddess. Then he fell on his knees before those men and implored them to tell him who they were. Slowly and reluctantly, for such was perhaps the will of heaven, they revealed to him that they were initiates in the lore called Chaldean, and even this they told enigmatically and with bent heads. And when Sosipatra's father clung to their knees and supplicated them, adjuring them to become masters of the estate and to keep his daughter under the influence and initiate her into still more sacred things, they nodded their assent to this, but spoke no word more. Then he took courage as though he had received some sacred promise or oracle, but could not grasp its meaning. In his heart he applauded Homer above all the poets for having sung of such a manifestation as this, so marvelous and divine. Yea, and the gods in the likeness of strangers from far countries put on all manner of shapes and wander through the cities. He didn't believe that he had fallen in with gods in the likeness of strangers. While his mind was full of this, he was overcome by sleep, and the others left the table, and taking the girl with them, they very tenderly and scrupulously handed her over to the whole array of garments in which she had been initiated, and added certain mystic symbols thereto. And they also put some books in Sosipatra's chest, and gave orders that she should have it sealed. And she, no less than her father, took the greatest delight in those men. When the day began to break, and the doors were open, and people began to go to their work, the men also, according to their custom, went forth with the rest. Then the girl ran to her father, bearing the good news, and one of the servants went with her to carry the chest. Her father asked for all the money belonging to him that happened to be available, and from his stewards all that they had for necessary expenses, and sent to call for those men. But they were nowhere to be seen. Then he said to Sosipatra, "What is the meaning of this, my child?" After a brief pause she replied, "Now at last I understand what they said. For when they wept and put these things into my hands, they said, 'Child, take care of them, for we are traveling to the western ocean, but presently we shall return.'" This proves very clearly that they who had appeared were blessed spirits. They then departed and went whithersoever it was. But her father took charge of the girl, now fully initiated, and though without pride, filled with divine breath, and he permitted her to live as she pleased, and did not interfere in any of her affairs, except that sometimes he was so ill-pleased with her silence. And when she grew to the full measure of her youthful vigor, she had no other teachers, but ever on her lips were the works of the poets, philosophers, and orators, and those works that others comprehend but incompletely and dimly, and then only by hard work and painful drudgery. She could expound with careless ease, serenely and painlessly, and with her light swift touch would make their meaning clear. Then she decided to marry. Now beyond dispute, Eustathius of all living men was alone worthy to wed her. So she said to him, and to those who were present, "Do you listen to me, Eustathius, and let those who are here bear me witness. I shall bear you 3 children, and all of them will fail to win what is considered to be human happiness. But as to the happiness that the gods bestow, not one of them will fail therein. But you will go hence before me, and be allotted a fair and fitting place of abode, though I perhaps shall attain to one even higher, for your station will be in the orbit of the moon, and only 5 years longer will you devote your services to philosophy, for so your phantom tells me. But you shall traverse the region below the moon with a blessed and easily guided motion. Fain would I tell you my own fate also." Then, after keeping silence for a short time, she cried aloud, "No, my God prevents me!" Immediately after this prophecy, for such was the will of the fates, she married Eustathius, and her words had the same force as an immutable oracle. So absolutely did it come to pass and transpire as had been foretold by her. I must relate also what happened after these events. After the passing of Eustathius, Sosipatra returned to her own estate and dwelt in Asia in the ancient city of Pergamon, and the famous Eustathius loved and cared for her and educated her sons. In her own home, Sosipatra held a chair of philosophy that rivaled his, and after attending the lectures of Eustathius, the students would go to hear hers. And though there was none that did not greatly appreciate and admire the accurate learning of Eustathius, they positively adored and revered the woman's inspired teaching. Now there was one Philometor, a kinsman of hers, who, overcome by her beauty and eloquence, and recognizing the divinity of her nature, fell in love with her, and his passion possessed him and completely overmastered him. Not only was he completely conquered by it, but she also felt its onslaught. So she said to Maximus, who was one of the most distinguished pupils of Eustathius and was moreover his kinsman, Maximus, pray find out what ailment I have, that I may not be troubled by it. When he inquired, Why, what ails you? She replied, When Philometor is with me, he is simply Philometor, and in no way different from the crowd. But when I see that he is going away, my heart within me is wounded, and tortured still it tries to escape from my breast. Do you exert yourself on my behalf, she added, and so display your piety? When he heard this, Maximus went away puffed up with pride, as though he were now associating with the gods, because so wonderful a woman had put such faith in him. Meanwhile, Philometor pursued his purpose, but Maximus, having discovered by his sacrificial lore what was the power that Philometor possessed, strove to counteract and nullify the weaker spell by one more potent and efficacious. When Maximus had completed this rite, he hastened to Sosipatra, and bade her observe carefully whether she had the same sensations in future. But she replied that she no longer felt them, and described to Maximus his own prayer and the whole ceremony. She also told him the hour at which it took place, as though she had been present, and revealed to him the omens that had appeared. And when he fell to the earth in amazement and proclaimed Sosipatra, visibly a goddess, she said, Rise, my son. The gods love you if you raise your eyes to them, and do not lean towards earthly and perishable riches. On hearing this, he went away more uplifted than before, with pride, seeing that he now had clear and certain proof of the woman's divine nature. Near the door he was met by Philometor, who was coming in, high spirits, with many of his friends, and with a loud voice Maximus called out to him from some distance, Friend Philometor, I adjure you in heaven's name, cease to burn wood to no purpose. Perhaps he said this with some inner knowledge of the malpractices in which the other was engaged. Thereupon Philometor was overawed by Maximus, believed him to be divine, and ceased his plotting, even ridiculing the course of action that he had entered on before. And for the future Sosipatra beheld Philometor with pure and unchanged eyes, though she admired him for so greatly admiring herself. Once, for example, when they were all met at her house, Philometor, however, was not at present, but was staying in the country. The theme under discussion and their inquiry was concerning the soul. Several theories were propounded, and then Sosipatra began to speak, and gradually, by her proofs, disposed of their arguments. Then she fell to discoursing on the descent of the soul, and what part of it is subject to punishment, what part immortal, when in the midst of her Bacchic and frenzied flow of speech she became silent, as though her voice had been cut off. And after letting a short interval pass, she cried aloud in their midst, What's this? Behold my kinsman Philometor riding in a carriage. The carriage has been overturned in a rough place in the road, and both his legs are in danger. However, his servants have dragged him out unharmed, except that he has received wounds on his elbows and hands, though even these are not dangerous. He's being carried home on a stretcher, groaning loudly. These were her words, and they were the truth, for so it actually was. By this all were convinced that Sosipatra was omnipresent, and that even as the philosophers assert concerning the gods, nothing happened without her being there to see. She died, leaving the 3 sons of whom we had spoken. The names of 2 of them I need not record, but Antoninus was worthy of his parents, for he settled at the Canobic mouth of the Nile, and devoted himself wholly to the religious rites of that place, and strove with all his powers to fulfill his mother's prophecy. To him resorted all the youth whose souls were sane and sound, and who hungered for philosophy, and the temple was filled with young men acting as priests. Though he himself still appeared to be human, and he associated with human beings, he foretold to all his followers that after his death the temple would cease to be, and even the great and holy temples of Serapeum would pass into formless darkness and be transformed, and that a fabulous and unseemly gloom would hold sway over the fairest things on earth. To all these prophecies time bore witness, and in the end his prediction gained the force of an oracle. From this family, for it is not my purpose to write Noei, as Hesiod's poem is called, there survived certain effluences, as though from the stars, and these were dispersed and distributed among various classes of professed philosophers who made a profit out of their affinity with genuine philosophy, and they spent most of their time running risks in the law courts, like Socrates in the porch of the king Archon. Such was their contempt for money and their detestation of gold. In fact, their philosophy consisted in wearing the philosopher's cloak, and constantly alluding to Sosipatra while Eustathius was ever on their lips. Moreover, they carried other obvious and external signs. Big wallets so crammed with books that they would have laden several camels. They had learned these very carefully by heart. And these books of theirs, anyhow, bore upon none of the ancient philosophers, but were wills and copies of wills, contracts of sales, and such like documents, which are highly esteemed in that life which is prone to dissolute folly and license. Thus it proved that Sosipatra could also divine correctly what should happen after these events. But I need not write down even the names of these men, for my narrative is eager to lead on to those that are not unworthy, but worthy. An exception must be made of one of her sons. His name was Antoninus, and I mentioned him just now. He crossed to Alexandria, and then so greatly admired and preferred the mouth of the Nile at Canobus, that he wholly dedicated and applied himself to the worship of the gods there, and to their sacred rites. He made rapid progress towards affinity with the divine, despised his body, freed himself from its pleasures, and embraced a wisdom that was hidden from the crowd. On this matter I may well speak at greater length. He displayed no tendency to thurgy, and that which is at variance with sensible appearances, perhaps because he kept a wary eye on the imperial views and policy which were opposed to these practices. But all admired his fortitude and his unswerving and inflexible character, and those who were then pursuing their studies at Alexandria used to go down to the shore and see him. For on account of its temple of Serapis, Alexandria was a world in itself, a world consecrated by religion. At any rate, those who resorted to it from all parts were a multitude equal in number to its own citizens, and these, after they had worshipped the god, used to hasten to Antoninus, some who were in haste, by land, while others were content with boats that plied on the river, gliding in a leisurely way to their studies. On being granted an interview with him, some would propound a logical problem, and were forthwith abundantly fed with the philosophy of Plato. But others, who raised questions as to things divine, encountered a statue, for he would utter not a word to any of them, but fixing his eyes and gazing up at the sky, he would lie there speechless and unrelenting, nor did anyone ever see him lightly enter into converse with any man on such themes as these. Now, not long after, an unmistakable sign was given that there was in him some diviner element, for no sooner had he left the world of men than the cult of the temples in Alexandria and that shrine of Serapis was scattered to the winds. And not only the ceremonies of the cult, but the buildings as well, and everything happened as in the midst of the poets, when the giants gained the upper hand. The temples at Canobus also suffered the same fate in the reign of Theodosius, when Theodosius presided over the abominable ones like a sort of Eurymedon, and Evagrius was prefect of the city, and Romanus in command of the legions in Egypt. For these men, girding themselves in their wrath against our sacred places, as though against stones and stonemasons, made a raid on the temples, and though they could not allege even a rumor of war to justify them, they demolished the temple of Serapis and made war against the temple offerings, whereby they won a victory without meeting a foe or fighting a battle. In this fashion they fought so strenuously against the statues and votive offerings that they not only conquered but stole them as well, and their only military tactics were to ensure that the thief should escape detection. Only the floor of the temple of Serapis they did not take, simply because of the weight of the stones, which were not easy to move from place to place. Then these warlike and honorable men, after they had thrown everything into confusion and disorder, and had thrust out hands, unstained indeed by blood, but not pure from greed, boasted that they had overcome the gods, and reckoned their sacrilege and impiety a thing to glory in. Next, into the sacred places they imported monks, as they called them, who were men in appearance, but led the lives of swine, and openly did and allowed countless unspeakable crimes. But this they accounted piety, to show contempt for things divine. For in those days every man who wore a black robe and consented to behave in unseemly fashion in public possessed the power of a tyrant. To such a pitch of virtue had the human race advanced. All this, however, I have described in my Universal History. They settled these monks at Canobus also, and thus they fettered the human race to the worship of slaves, and those not even honest slaves, instead of the true gods. For they collected the bones and skulls of criminals who had been put to death for numerous crimes, men whom the law courts of the city had condemned to punishment, made them out to be gods, haunted their sepulchres, and thought that they became better by defiling themselves at their graves. Martyrs, the dead men were called, and ministers of a sort, and ambassadors from gods to carry men's prayers. These slaves in vilest servitude, who had been consumed by stripes and carried on their phantom forms the scars of their villainy, however, these are gods that earth produces. This then greatly increased the reputation of Antoninus also for foresight, in that he had foretold to all that the temples would become tombs. Likewise the famous Iamblichus, as I have handed down in my account of his life, when a certain Egyptian invoked Apollo, and to the great amazement of those who saw the vision, Apollo came. "My friends," said he, "cease to wonder. This is only the ghost of a gladiator." So great a difference does it make whether one beholds a thing with the intelligence or with the deceitful eyes of the flesh. But Iamblichus saw through marvels that were present, whereas Antoninus foresaw future events. This fact of itself argues his superior powers. His end came painlessly when he had attained to ripe old age, free from sickness. And to all intelligent men, the end of the temples, which he had prognosticated, was painful indeed.